The evening lights of the Grand Plaza Hotel cast a warm glow across the marble floors as Mai hustled between tables, expertly balancing plates of steaming gourmet dishes. The gentle clink of fine china and soft murmur of conversation filled the air of the upscale restaurant. Despite her tired feet and aching back, she maintained perfect posture and a gentle smile, skills ingrained from years of piano training at one of the world's most prestigious music schools. Life had a funny way of taking unexpected turns. Just 18 months ago, she had been preparing for her final recital at the conservatory, dreaming of concert halls and standing ovations. Now, here she was, memorizing drink orders and explaining the difference between Béarnaise and Hollandaise sauce to demanding guests. The irony wasn't lost on her. Between serving courses, she would sometimes catch glimpses of the beautiful baby grand piano in the corner, its polished surface gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. During quiet moments, her fingers would unconsciously move through the patterns of Chopin's nocturnes as she refilled water glasses. The muscle memory remained, even if the dream had been put on hold. Her fellow servers knew nothing of her background. To them, she was just the quiet, hard-working girl who never complained about taking the difficult tables or staying late to help close. Only Mr. Kumar, the kindly restaurant manager, knew her story. He had caught her one morning before opening, ghosting her fingers over the piano keys without making a sound. Instead of scolding her, he had simply nodded with understanding and pretended not to notice when she did it again. The weight of her graduate school tuition loomed large, as did the stack of medical bills from her mother's recent surgery. Each time she checked her savings account, the numbers seemed to mock her previous life's ambitions. But Mai refused to let circumstances dim her spirit. She took pride in her work, treating each table with the same attention to detail she once gave to complex musical scores. Tonight was particularly busy, with several corporate events filling the private dining rooms. The kitchen was in a constant state of controlled chaos, and even the most experienced servers were showing signs of stress. Yet Mai moved through it all with grace, her steps as measured as a dancer's, her timing impeccable. She had learned more about rhythm from carrying precarious trays of champagne flutes than she ever had in music theory class. As she approached table 12 with a fresh round of martinis, she couldn't help but notice the restored Steinway in the corner seemed to be watching her, patient and knowing, like an old friend waiting for the right moment to speak up. Little did she know that this ordinary evening was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would remind her that sometimes life's greatest performances happen when we least expect them. The persistent ache in her feet, the mental math of calculating tips, the careful dance of avoiding collisions with other servers, it was all part of a different kind of symphony now. But underneath her pressed uniform and professional demeanor, the heart of a musician still beat strongly, waiting for its moment to be heard again. The night was young, the dining room was full, and somewhere between the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted as the clock struck to make an unexpected reservation. Through the grand entrance walked Mr. Zhang, one of the city's most notorious business tycoons, followed by a group of expensive suits and designer dresses. Their laughter echoed a bit too loudly across the dining room, drawing subtle glances from other guests trying to enjoy their quiet dinners. Mr. Kumar caught Mia's eye and gave her an apologetic look as he directed the group to table 7, her section. She understood immediately. She was the only server who had never lost composure with difficult customers. Taking a deep breath, she approached the table with menus and her usual gentle smile. "Good evening and welcome to the Grand Plaza," she began, but Mr. Zhang cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Bring us your finest champagne, 6 bottles, and tell the chef we want the tasting menu, but make it quick. We don't have all night." He barely looked up from his phone, his gold watch catching the light as he scrolled. Maya nodded professionally and turned to leave, but one of the women called after her. "And make sure they prepare everything gluten-free. I simply can't have any cross-contamination." "Of course, ma'am. I'll inform the kitchen right away." For the next hour, May moved smoothly between the kitchen and table 7. fielding increasingly demanding requests with unshakable patience. The champagne wasn't chilled enough. The lighting was too bright, then too dim. Each complaint was met with the same calm efficiency, though her feet were screaming in protest from the constant back and forth. As she cleared the main course plates, she couldn't help but notice her hands. Pianist's hands, her old teacher used to call them. Long fingers made for reaching difficult octaves, maintained despite months of carrying heavy trays and washing dishes. Mr. Zhang noticed too, but not in the way she expected. "Look at this," he announced to his companions, gesturing at May with his nearly empty champagne glass. "Our waitress thinks she's too good for us. See how she moves. Like she's performing at some fancy concert hall instead of serving us dinner." The table erupted in laughter, but May kept her face neutral as she stacked plates. She'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't determined by other people's behavior. "Tell me," Mr. Zhang continued, his voice carrying across the now quieter restaurant, "what makes you so special? Did you study at some prestigious school before ending up here?" A few nearby diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mai could feel Mr. Kumar watching from across the room, ready to intervene if needed. But she stood her ground, hands steady as she gathered the last of the plates. "Everyone has their own path, sir," she replied quietly. "Would you like to see the dessert menu?" Something in her composed response seemed to irritate Mr. Zhang further. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with narrowed eyes. Then a smile spread across his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll make you a deal," he announced, pulling out his wallet. $10,000 cash, right now, if you can prove you have any real talent. Any talent at all. He patted the baby grand piano mockingly. "Maybe you'd like to give us a little performance." The table erupted in laughter again, but this time it was edged with something meaner. Mai felt every eye in the restaurant on her. The weight of her mother's medical bills pressed heavily on her mind, along with next semester's tuition deadline. The piano seemed to call to her from its corner, both tempting and terrifying. In that moment, standing amid the crystal glasses and fine china, Mai felt the crossroads of her two worlds colliding. The path she'd chosen and the path she'd been forced to leave behind were suddenly merging in ways she never expected. The question wasn't just about money or pride anymore. It was about who she really was and who she wanted to be. Time seemed to slow down as Mai stood there, still holding the stack of dirty plates. The weight in her arms was nothing compared to the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She could hear her mother's voice from their last phone call. "Don't worry about the hospital bills. Focus on your studies." But May knew the truth. Her mother had already remortgaged the house to help pay for her first year at the conservatory. The memory of her last performance floated through her mind. It was 15 months ago, but she could still feel the smooth keys under her fingers, still hear the thunderous applause that had filled the concert hall. That was before her mother's diagnosis changed everything. Before she had to trade practice rooms for dining rooms, concert halls for kitchen calls. Her coworker Lai quietly appeared beside her, gently taking the plates from her hands. "I've got these," she whispered, giving Mia's arm a supportive squeeze. Around the restaurant, other servers were slowing their pace, watching the scene unfold. They'd never seen Mia as anything but the reliable waitress who helped everyone else with their difficult tables. Now, curiosity painted their faces as they wondered what she would do. Mr. Kumar stepped forward from his spot near the host stand, ready to intervene, but May caught his eye and gave a slight shake of her head. This was her moment to handle, her choice to make. The restaurant had become more than just a job to her. These people were her second family, supporting her through long nights and difficult customers. Mr. Zhang's money still sat on the table, the edges of the bills catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. $10,000. It would cover 3 months of her mother's medication, or half a semester's tuition, or the overdue rent on her tiny apartment. The possibilities swirled in her mind like leaves in an autumn wind. But it wasn't really about the money was it? That beautiful Steinway in the corner had been watching her for months, silently witnessing her struggle between two worlds. How many times had she wiped its surface during closing, letting her hand linger just a moment too long? How many quiet mornings had she spent remembering the feel of those keys under her fingers while setting up for breakfast service? Her hands, which had just been carrying plates and pouring wine, suddenly felt empty. They remembered a different kind of work, hours of scales, arpeggios, and complex rhythms. Years of practice, dedication, and dreams that she'd carefully packed away, but never quite forgotten. The other diners had stopped eating, their meals growing cold as they watched the scene play out. An older couple who came in every Thursday night gave her encouraging smiles. They had always been kind to her, leaving generous tips and asking about her day. What would they think if they knew who she really was? What would any of them think? A burst of laughter from Mr. Zhang's table cut through her thoughts. "Well?" he called out, his voice carrying that edge of superiority that suggested he'd already won. "We're waiting. Unless, of course, you're just another server pretending to be something you're not." Mai felt her spine straighten, years of performance training taking over. She looked at the piano again, its lid propped open like an invitation. The instrument wasn't just a piece of furniture or a prop for the restaurant's ambience. It was a bridge between her past and present, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory again, but this time from years ago, when Mai had been too nervous to perform at her first recital. Music isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about being true to yourself. The restaurant held its breath as Mai slowly removed her serving apron. Her hands, which had spent the evening carrying plates and folding napkins, were steady. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about the money anymore. She wasn't thinking about the eyes watching her or the mocking laughter that had now died down to curious silence. She was thinking about all the mornings she'd spent practicing in empty classrooms before sunrise, all the nights she'd fallen asleep with sheet music scattered across her bed, all the dreams she'd carefully folded away, but never truly abandoned. The sound of Mai's apron being folded seemed unusually loud in the hushed restaurant. She placed it carefully on an empty service station, smoothed her black uniform pants, and turned toward Mr. Kumar. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, she saw not her boss, but the man who had caught her countless times looking longingly at the piano during quiet moments. Mr. Kumar's face softened with understanding. He gave her a slight nod, the kind that carried more meaning than words could express. It wasn't just permission to step away from her duties, it was acknowledgement of who she really was, who she had always been. The distance between the service station and the piano was only about 20 steps, but to Mai, it felt like crossing an ocean. The click of her sensible work shoes on the marble floor echoed through the now silent dining room. She could feel Mr. Zhang and his guests watching her, their expressions a mixture of amusement and curiosity. The other diners had stopped eating entirely, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. As she approached the piano, memories washed over her like gentle waves. Her first lesson at age 6, sitting on phone books to reach the keys. The proud smile on her mother's face during her first public performance. The calluses on her fingers from practicing 8 hours a day. The acceptance letter from the conservatory that had made her cry with joy. The piano bench was cool and smooth beneath her as she sat down. She adjusted it with the practiced movement of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Muscle memory taking over despite the months away. The keys gleamed under the chandelier light, pristine white and deep black, waiting patiently for her touch. Behind her, she heard someone at Mr. Zhang's table whisper, "Is she really going to do it?" Followed by poorly suppressed laughter. But those voices seemed far away now. In this moment, it was just her and the piano. Old friends meeting again after a long separation. Lai, who had been carrying a tray of water glasses, set them down and leaned against the wall, her face full of curiosity about her usually quiet coworker. In the kitchen doorway, the chef and line cooks peered out, drawn by the unusual silence in the dining room. Even the dishwasher, still wearing his rubber gloves, stepped out to watch. May placed her hands on the keys, feeling their familiar coolness. She closed her eyes for just a moment, letting out a slow breath. The restaurant's ambient noise faded away. The gentle clink of glasses, the whispered conversations, the distant sounds from the kitchen. All that remained was the quiet before the music. In that suspended moment, she thought of her mother, probably sitting at home reading letters from the hospital's billing department. She thought of her old practice room at the conservatory, now occupied by another student chasing their dreams. She thought of all the times in the past months she told herself that this chapter of her life was over. But sitting here now, she realized that music hadn't just been a chapter in her life. It was the whole story. Everything else, including these months of serving and saving, was just a temporary pause between movements. Mr. Zhang's voice cut through her thoughts one last time. Well, we're waiting to be impressed. The sarcasm in his voice was thick, but it no longer had the power to hurt her. Maid opened her eyes and looked up at the magnificent crystal chandelier hanging above the piano. Its light scattered across the dining room like stars, transforming the ordinary restaurant into something magical. She flexed her fingers once, twice, a pianist's ritual as familiar as breathing. Then, with the certainty of someone stepping onto a path they've always known was theirs, she lifted her hands and prepared to play. In that moment, she wasn't a waitress about to perform for a bet. She was simply a musician, ready to let her music speak the truth that words never could. The first notes filled the air like drops of rain before a storm. Mi's fingers moved across the keys with the gentle touch of someone greeting an old friend. She had chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece she performed at her last recital, the one her mother said always made her cry. The opening chords grew stronger, deeper, filling every corner of the restaurant with their rich sound. A woman at a nearby table put down her fork, her eyes widening in recognition. An elderly man who had been complaining about his soup moments ago sat back in his chair, his face softening with wonder. Mr. Zhang's smug smile began to fade as the music built in intensity. His companions, who had been checking their phones and whispering jokes, now sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed on Mi's hands as they danced across the keys. The difficult runs that had once required hours of practice flowed effortlessly, as if the months away from the piano had never happened. In the kitchen doorway, the chef removed his hat, holding it against his chest. Lai, still standing by the service station, felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. Mr. Kumar stood straighter, pride replacing his usual professional reserve as he watched his quiet, hard-working server transform before his eyes. The music swelled, filling the high ceilings with emotion that no words could capture. Mi's whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly as her hands crossed over each other, finding each note with perfect precision. Her shoulders, usually tense from carrying heavy trays, moved freely with the rhythm. Her face, typically schooled into a polite server's smile, now showed the pure joy of someone doing exactly what they were born to do. A young boy eating dinner with his parents tugged on his mother's sleeve. "How does she remember where all the notes are?" he whispered loudly. His mother simply shook her head, too moved to speak. Even the kitchen staff, who usually rushed to keep up with orders, stood mesmerized by the door, their usual urgency forgotten. The piece reached its most challenging section, the part that had once made May's teachers hold their breath. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed, each note crystal clear despite the tempo. The music filled the space like a living thing, making the crystal glasses vibrate softly on the tables. One of Mr. Zhang's guests knocked over a water glass, but nobody moved to clean it up. The spilled water went unnoticed, every eye in the room fixed on the young woman at the piano. Through it all, Mad remained in her own world, connected to something larger than herself. She wasn't thinking about the bet anymore, or the bills, or the months of struggling to make ends meet. She wasn't even thinking about the shocked faces of her audience. She was thinking about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for her first piano lessons. About her old teacher, who had stayed late after classes to help her perfect difficult passages. About all the moments that had led her here, to this unexpected stage. As she approached the final movement, her hands moved with increasing confidence and power. The melodies soared above the harmonies like a bird taking flight. A woman at table 12 was openly crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. One of the line cooks quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Even the usually stoic dishwasher had stepped fully out of the kitchen, his wet hands dripping on the floor as he stood transfixed. The last notes of the piece hung in the air like stars, bright and clear and perfect. For a moment, no one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The usual sounds of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the distant noise of traffic outside, had all faded away. There was only the lingering echo of the final chord, resonating through the silent room like a prayer. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. It started with a single person, the elderly man who had been complaining about his soup, and spread like wildfire through the restaurant. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, bouncing off the marble floors and high ceilings. People stood from their tables, napkins falling forgotten to the floor. Mr. Zhang sat completely still, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like shame. The stack of money he had placed on the table as a taunt now seemed small and meaningless compared to what they had just witnessed. His companions, who had been laughing earlier, were now standing with everyone else, their faces reflecting genuine awe. A woman in a designer dress at table 15 wiped tears from her eyes and turned to her husband. "She plays just like they do at the symphony hall," she whispered, though in the din of applause, several people nearby could hear her. "Better, even." The kitchen staff had abandoned any pretense of working. The chef was clapping so hard his face had turned red, and even the stern-faced dishwasher had a wide smile. Lai, still standing by her service station, had given up trying to hide her tears. An older gentleman in an expensive suit made his way through the crowded restaurant to the piano. He waited for the applause to die down before introducing himself. "I'm the director of the City Symphony Orchestra," he said, pulling out a business card with slightly shaking hands. "We have an opening next month for a special performance series. Would you consider auditioning?" Before Mai could respond, another voice called out from across the room. "I'm a producer with Classical Records," a woman in a red blazer announced, also approaching the piano. "We should talk about your future." Mr. Kumar stepped forward, his usual professional demeanor barely containing his pride. "Perhaps we could move this discussion somewhere more private," he suggested, gesturing toward his office. But first, he turned to May and did something no one had ever seen him do. He bowed slightly, showing respect not to a server, but to an artist. The other diners were still standing, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Many had their phones out, having recorded the unexpected performance. A young couple who came in for their anniversary dinner were already posting the video online, their hands shaking with excitement as they typed. Mai remained seated at the piano, her hands now folded in her lap. Her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were clear and bright. She looked different somehow, as if she had finally taken off a mask she'd been wearing for months. When she stood, it was with the natural grace of a performer, not the practiced efficiency of a server. Mr. Zhang cleared his throat and stood up, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. He picked up the stack of bills from the table and walked toward the piano. "I believe I owe you this," he said quietly, extending the money toward Mai. "Though it seems terribly inadequate now." But May shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Keep it," she said softly. "Some things are worth more than money." Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the same quiet dignity she had shown all evening. The other diners, who had been straining to hear the exchange, broke into applause again. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 10, its chimes almost lost in the continuing buzz of excitement. Guests who had finished their meals an hour ago remained seated, discussing what they had just witnessed. Phones were ringing as people called friends and family to share what had happened. The entire atmosphere of the restaurant had transformed from a typical fine dining establishment into something electric with possibility. 3 weeks had passed since that remarkable night, but the buzz hadn't died down. The video of May's performance had spread across social media like wildfire, touching hearts far beyond the walls of the Grand Plaza. Local news stations had picked up the story, celebrating it as a reminder that extraordinary talent could be found in the most unexpected places. The restaurant had changed too. A small brass plaque now sat beside the piano, reading "Where Dreams Take Flight," Mr. Kumar's idea. Every night, guests would ask to be seated near the instrument, hoping to catch a glimpse of the waitress who had become an overnight sensation. Some even brought their own children taking piano lessons, wanting to show them that persistence and passion could lead to magical moments. Maya still carried plates and filled water glasses, but now she did it with a different energy. The weight of hidden dreams no longer pressed down on her shoulders. During breaks, she would sometimes play short pieces for the guests, transforming ordinary dinner services into memorable experiences. Mr. Kumar had officially added house pianist to her duties with a proper salary to match. The symphony orchestra audition had gone beautifully. The same passion that had silenced the restaurant that night had moved the selection committee to tears. They offered her a position on the spot, along with a scholarship to complete her graduate studies. But perhaps more meaningful was the call Mai had received from the hospital. An anonymous donor had paid her mother's medical bills in full. Though Mr. Zhang never admitted it, the timing was hard to ignore. Lai had hugged her tightly after hearing the news about the symphony position. "You'll still visit us, right?" she had asked, half joking, but with real emotion in her voice. The kitchen staff had celebrated by preparing Mi's favorite staff meal, a gesture that meant more to her than any formal congratulations. The restaurant's dishwasher, who rarely spoke to anyone, had surprised everyone by revealing he had been saving video clips of famous pianists on his phone during breaks. "I knew there was something special about the way you moved your hands," he said quietly one day. Artists recognize artists. On her last regular shift, every table seemed to have a story to share. The elderly couple who came every Thursday reminded her how they had witnessed her journey from the beginning. A young girl, dining with her parents, shyly showed Mai the piano piece she was learning. The chef emerged from the kitchen to present her with a cake he had made specially, decorated with tiny fondant piano keys. The dining room was packed that evening, not with the usual dinner crowd, but with people who had become part of her story. Regular customers who had watched her quiet dedication over months of service, coworkers who had become family, and even some of the guests from that fateful night. Mr. Zhang himself had made a reservation, this time without his usual entourage. As the evening drew to a close, Mai sat down at the piano one last time as a waitress. The same instrument that had helped her reclaim her dreams now felt like an old friend. She began to play. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but a simple, heartfelt melody she had composed herself. It spoke of patience and perseverance, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, of kindness found in unexpected places. Mr. Kumar watched from his usual spot, remembering the quiet girl who had applied for a server position all those months ago. In the kitchen doorway, the staff gathered to listen, their usual end-of-shift tasks momentarily forgotten. Even the street noise outside seemed to quiet down, as if the city itself was paying respect to this final performance. The last notes faded away into the warm evening air, but their echo would remain in the heart of the Grand Plaza. Sometimes the most beautiful symphonies in life aren't played in grand concert halls, but in ordinary places where extraordinary courage takes root and blooms.